making process. It is an understatement to say that Kenyan independent constitution endured a legacy of hyper amendment during the post-independent period. The former constitution was flexible, giving the legislative wide power and discretion in amending it. As a result, Parliament undertook so many amendments to the constitution that it lost its original character. The most significant amendments being the merger of the Senate and the House of Representatives to establish a unicameral legislature, abolition of the quasi-federal regional governments that led to the establishment of a unitary state, and alteration of the entrenched majorities required for constitutional amendment, making it easier to amend the constitution. Yet another repulsive amendment was the abolition of the security of tenure for judges and other constitutional office holders. Ultimately, the amendment that finally broke the proverbial camel's back, giving rise to the clamor for a new constitutional order, was the one that converted the country from a multi-party democracy to a de jure one-party state in 1982. Informed by this history, Kenyans yearned for a stable constitutional system where the power to amend the constitution would not be abused for short-term interest by political elite. The CKRC report records at page 74 that Kenyans expressed what they wanted, and I quote, "There is a need to protect the constitution against indiscriminate amendments." What emerges from the historical account is that there was a strong concern that the country should adopt provisions on amendment power that are able to protect the constitutional order from abusive amendments. But this was not all. There was also a recognition that the constitution must remain flexible in order to adjust to political, social, economic, technological, and other changes that take place in the polity. In effect, the overarching imperative that informed the drafting of Chapter 16 was the need to find a proper balance between rigidity and flexibility. The quest for a balance between rigidity and flexibility is evident in the tiered amendment provisions in Chapter 16, which stipulates 3 pathways for amending the Constitution. The first pathway, under Article 256, provides for amendment by parliamentary initiative. This process involves public participation and approval by the Houses of Parliament through a vote of endorsement by 2/3 of all members of each House during the second and third reading of the amendment bill. The second pathway, under Article 257, provides for amendment by popular initiative. This process involves collection of at least 1 million signatures from registered voters in support of the popular initiative by the promoters of the initiative. Approval of the initiative by the majority of the county assemblies, and passage of the bill by the majority of the members of each House of Parliament. In this second process, if either House of Parliament fails to pass the bill, the proposed amendment is submitted to the people in a referendum. The third pathway, under Article 255, relates to what has come to be known as the entrenched provisions of the Constitution. Some of the Court of Appeal judges referred to these entrenched provisions as forming the basic structure of the Constitution. Article 255(1) of the Constitution stipulates that in addition to adopting either the parliamentary initiative or popular initiative pathway, where an amendment relates to the following articles, a bill to amend those provisions shall be subjected to a referendum. These are the supremacy of the Constitution, the territory of Kenya, the sovereignty of the people, the national values and principles of governance in Article 10(2), the Bill of Rights, the term of office of the President, the independence of the judiciary and commissions and independent offices, to which Chapter 15 applies, the functions of Parliament, the objects, principles, and structure of devolved government, or the provisions of Chapter 16 on amendment of the Constitution. Approval through the envisaged referendum under Article 255(2) must satisfy two conditions. At least 25% of the registered voters in each of at least a half of the counties should vote in the referendum, and such an amendment should be supported by a simple majority of the citizens. A reading of the three pathways for amending the Constitution in Chapter 16 clearly shows that Kenyans were alive to the historical legacy of the culture of IPA amendment in the pre-2010 era and sought to tame any abuse of the amendment power. In particular, Article 255(1) and 2 of the Constitution demonstrates that, alive to the culture of IPA amendments, the Kenyan people sought to ring-fence the core fundamental commitments of the Constitution by entrenching them and subjecting the process of amendment to deepened public participation, as well as imposing a downstream constrained veto by stipulating that the entrenched provisions enumerated in Article 255(1) of the Constitution can only be amended through a referendum process. The rationale of entrenching the provisions mentioned in Article 255(1) of the Constitution is, in my view, informed by the very democratic idea that constitutional amendments of a fundamental nature should take place through a deeply participatory process and be ratified by the people, being the ultimate sovereign of the polity, through a referendum. The approach in balancing flexibility and rigidity in constitutional amendment adopted in Chapter 16 reflects and compares favorably with modern constitutional architecture and design. Drafters of contemporary constitutions pursue the goal of balancing rigidity and flexibility through what has been termed as tiered design amendment rules. This argument is augmented by the article cited before us by Professor Rosalind Dixon and David Randau in their writing titled Tiered Constitutional Design. Under the tiered constitutional model, amendment rules vary with provisions that are core to fundamental to constitutional systems being placed on a higher tier and made more difficult to amend. The amendment rules under the Constitution adopt this modern tiered constitutional design, combining the virtues of rigidity and flexibility by having different amendment procedures apply to different parts of the Constitution. The core foundational values, principles, and structures of the Constitution have been granted a higher level of entrenchment to ensure the stability of the constitutional system. It follows, therefore, that Kenyans were conscious of the core constitutional values, principles, and structures that they wanted protected from abusive amendments, and they protected them through entrenched provisions in Article 255 of the Constitution. In my view, therefore, the framers of the Constitution, well aware of the basic structure doctrine, chose to ring-fence some key features from flexible amendments. And if it was their intention to provide for eternity clauses or the basic structure doctrine, nothing would have stopped them from doing so. The next question that follows is whether it was necessary for the two superior courts to adopt the basic structure doctrine and thereby devise a fourth-way path for amending the Constitution outside the three pathways that are stipulated in Chapter 16. To answer this question requires one to appreciate how the High Court and the majority of the Court of Appeal judges proceeded to analyze Chapter 16. It was on the premise that based on the history of IPAR amendments of the repealed Constitution during the pre-2010 dispensation, the Constitution demanded heightened procedures beyond the tiered design of the amendment procedures provided in Chapter 16 that would make the Constitution more difficult to amend. The two courts, therefore, did not go into a detailed analysis and to specifically point out the actual shortcomings of the provisions of Chapter 16, especially in light of all the 21 unsuccessful attempts that have been made over time, over the last 10 years, to amend the Constitution. The Court of Appeal, in my respectful view, and a duty to analyze the findings of the High Court and specifically point out whether there were apparent inadequacies as far as the provisions of Chapter 16 were concerned. Looking at the history, as stated above, as well as the provisions of Chapter 16, it is clear to me that Kenyans sought to achieve a balance between rigidity and flexibility in the amendment process. Kenyans did not want to shift from one extreme of IPAR amendment to another extreme where no amendment can take place. That is, from IPAR amendment to ultra rigidity in the amendment process. Rather, what Kenyans desired is a balance between rigidity and flexibility, as reflected in the tiered amendment process in Chapter 16 of the Constitution, with the core or essential features of the Constitution being accorded heightened protection, but still open to amendment through an enhanced, inclusive, and participatory process.